This is how oysters can fix New York City's polluted, destroyed water system. I'm fumbling on my chair. But anyways, why are we talking about oysters now? So oysters, or first off, part of the purpose here is to restore the love for life through the exploration of nature. So that's what we're doing. And oysters, I don't know, I'm kind of interested in them, so we're going to talk about them. But before I get into this, newsletter in the description, Ultimate Tobacco course in the description, Instagram in the description. Massive value in there. Become a fellow rebel. But anyways, oysters. I live in New York, and oysters used to be huge in New York. You know, the Lenape tribe, which was, or the Lenape, I don't even know what to call them, the native people called the Lenape. They ate a lot of oysters, and archaeologists found these things called middens, which is just piles of oyster shells all around New York. And due to industrialization and building roads and all that stuff, a lot of them had to get cleared out. There's still a couple, I think, in Long Island, Rockaway Beach, but other than that, it's basically done. So oysters in New York. Oysters used to be the staple food of New York. Before pizza, before fucking hot dogs, pretzels, it was oysters. And the problem is that overfishing, bad preservation practices, and just selfishness led to the demise of the oyster population. And now New York Harbor, New York Jersey Harbor, um, the water systems are all polluted now, because what oysters do is that they clean the water through their filtration system, and we'll talk about that. I'll write out or draw out the anatomy of an oyster on this fucking whiteboard. But before, that's later in the video. Um, and it's important to understand that oysters were basically the population of oysters. I think it was like oysters had like 60% of the world's I mean, New York had like 60% of the world's oyster population, which is crazy if you think about it. Now, by 1916, all the oyster beds in New York were basically, done for. By 1927, it lost its status as the oyster capital of the world. And I actually went to Grand Central Station the other day for Halloween. I went to the city. And there was, the Grand Central Oyster Bar. That was one of the first oyster bars, or the biggest oyster bars. It wasn't the first at all, but it was one of the biggest oyster bars to open in New York, and it closed and then it reopened, and now it's still a thing. Obviously, they don't get the oysters, excuse me, from New York, because there are still oysters, and they're doing things to restore the oyster population. We'll talk about that, but it's not. They're not. You can't eat them because you're gonna get heavy metal poisoning. You're gonna get fucking sick because the waters are so toxic. And the toxic waters, guys, this is no good. No one wins from this. And it's big around the world with industrialization, um, advancements in society. Um, in the process, we destroy the waters, and basically all life happens from the water. So if the waters are toxic and filled with heavy metals and pesticides and plastics, all this stuff, that bleeds onto the land. And this just causes a problem for everyone. So, what do we do to fix this? I don't know. But oysters can be a big piece to that puzzle, and restoring the oyster population can be an even bigger piece of that puzzle. So, where do we go from here? Nowadays, it may seem that, oysters are this, delicacy, but that's not really true. That's not really true. It hasn't been true in the past. Uh, Oysters were available to basically every status, or middle class, lower class, poor people, rich people. They were available to everyone. So you had this nutrient dense food that was available to everyone. You know, it was basically free game because there was so much. Now, you could talk to some people. Some people have never had an oyster in their life, and in New York, that would never be a thing, ever. Basically, everyone had oysters. Now it's like, what is an oyster? I don't want to see that. I personally don't want to see that. It's not even that the fact you have to like. I don't give a fuck if you like oysters or not. It's more of the fact like that we see a species of oysters, the oyster population just decrease, and we know that that species can heal the water, filters the water, and it's basically gone. Like that's a problem, and it needs to be solved. And when we're talking about what we can do, and what New York is doing, but yeah, it's a big problem. One of the biggest mistakes New Yorkers made when it comes to oysters was that they didn't dump the shells back into the water. So the point of dumping a shell back into the water instead of just throwing it in a furnace is that it's a home, right? So the oyster, the shell isn't the oyster; it's inside. It's one of the only animals you eat alive. It's basically always alive if its shell's closed, and you throw the shells back in the water so new oysters can house themselves in it, right? Because it's like basically home. If there's no oyster shells, where the fuck are the oysters gonna live? They're gonna die. So that's the point of the shell, and it's important to throw it back in the water instead of burning it, and that's what most New Yorkers did, and people around the world. Now, is that did they know? That there's a big whole debate about that, but now we know. So throw your oyster shells back in the water, and New York passed this Clean Water Act, you know, whatever that may be. But even like I think it was like 50 years ago, even maybe longer than that. New York's waters are the cleanest they've been in 100 years. I will say that. They've done work, but still a lot of work to do. Now, how does how did the pollution start? Well, from industrialization and the density of New York, like, and the architect and the infrastructure of New York, all of it contributes to the toxicity, right? Because you have such a dense population, and basically, are is it possible to have such a dense population and not run into problems like this? Um, Maybe in the future we'll figure something better out. Maybe there is like a solar punk cities around the world. Maybe like Netherlands. Netherlands, I heard, is good at that. But New York is terrible at that. And I'm not dissing New York. I'm just saying New York City. I'm just saying that when you have such a dense population and then the way it's structured on the water, it's hard not to pollute the water, right? Because people are running around. It's basically there's fucking it's like a third world country in some places in New York City. People don't give a fuck about the water when they're just trying to survive. So you run into that problem. It's like, how do you heal the water if people are stuck in survival and they just really can't even focus on higher things like that? So it's basically it's a structural problem. It's an economic problem. It's you know an education problem. There's so many factors that go into it that if I just said, throw oyster shells back in the water, it's not that easy. Like it's not, and I understand that. But we could start somewhere. We could start somewhere, 100%. And if you've ever been to New York, there's a lot of ships coming in and out. It's a port, right? So there's a lot of ships coming in and out, and the problem is that these ships, some ships, I forgot what they're called, like seafaring ships, I don't know, but they they sweep up you know pollution and stuff on the bottom of the ocean, and that just redistributes it all around. Whereas oysters, they filter that, but there's not enough to filter that. It takes them over like a year and a half, the oyster population now in New York City, to actually filter the whole entire water. Whereas before, you know, when oyster population was larger and more dense, they could do it in a week. That's insane, guys. Understand that. Nowadays, oyster population in New York cannot even fill. It takes a year and a half to filter the entire water system. Now it takes, or back in the day, it took a week. That's crazy. That's crazy. Now, you may be asking what's actually in the water, like what chemicals and pollutions actually in the water. Well, plastics, microplastics, heavy metals, which are a huge problem. PCBs, I think it's PHAs, a bunch of shit that you don't want to be ingesting, and most people are ingesting this through tap water, birth control pills, fluoride, chlorine, all this stuff that they put in the tap water. People are consuming this on a daily basis, and it, fluoride, whatever. So I can go into that, but these things are not good for you. It's not the point of the video to go into that, but they're not good for you. Now, oysters can't solve all these problems, but they can solve a lot through their filtration system. Okay, so I drew out the oyster anatomy. That's an oyster, believe it or not. But so oysters are bivalves, and it's important to understand that oysters in dirty water mix like peanut butter and jelly because they're filter feeders, and bivalves are animals with a soft shell. I mean, with a soft body and then a harder shell, and they're filter feeders. There's also other animals that are filter feeders. I think a flamingo is actually a filter feeder. So what they do is they absorb food through their gills, which are right here, and this is like the oyster opened up. So they absorb food through their gills, and they basically turn that into poop. So they absorb food, waste products, all that sewage, sewer sludge, algae through their gills, and then they do it and they let it go in the form of poop that's not toxic to the environment. So that's the point, right? So they filter all of that and then turn it into a non-toxic byproduct. And that's important because we need that. If we don't have this, the pollution just sits on the bottom of the ocean floor and you're left with it there just to poison people and basically other animals. So they played a very important role. So we have the adductor muscle attachment and then the adductor muscle. This is what you pull off. So if you ever open an oyster, you know, not with your hands because it's impossible, because it's actually like 20 pounds of force being pushed on an oyster. So you use your tool, you open it up, that adductor muscle that separates, that's the adductor muscle, and that's basically what keeps it in place. So just got to open that up. And then you have the belly, you have the fringe, you have the hinge, all that stuff. So that's basically it for the oyster anatomy. Not that hard. I just wanted to show the purpose of the gills and how important they are to the filtration system of the oyster. I'll actually explain this a little bit deeper and how oyster gills actually filter out toxic byproducts. So in the gills, like your lungs, we have something called cilia, and the toxic products stick to that cilia, and then it creates a mucus, and it excretes that mucus out of its body. Like I said, through poop. It's poop, but I don't think it's really poop. But it's non-toxic for the environment, and it helps clean up the sea. That's the point of oysters. They're good at that. They're filter feeders. They clean the ocean. So it's important to have them in the ocean. And the oyster doesn't excrete all everything it eats. Obviously, it has to eat to survive, but it excretes through the mucus and gills and all that stuff going down the channel into the digestive system. It excretes the toxic stuff, right? So it keeps all the nutrients it needs, whatever, and then it excretes the toxic stuff, where that's like the heavy metals, the well, I don't think it does it with heavy metals. It's more like the excess nitrogen sediments, um, pesticides, agrochemical stuff like that. It excretes it. So that's the oyster anatomy in a nutshell. That's your science class, or science class? No, 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 zoology. We'll say zoology class. Now, there's many different types of oysters. Like the ones in New York don't really produce pearls. It's thought that all oysters produce pearls. That's not the case. There's many different oysters, basically infinite. So this is oyster infinity, oyster god. So oysters, there's so many different kinds because environments, sea types of seas or types of water, everything's changing in the environment. So oyster and the way the water hits the shells, all of that basically creates a different and unique type of oyster. And the environment's always changing. There's basically an infinite number of different environments. So there's basically an infinite number of oysters. That's exciting because what if there's oysters we have never found yet? Like you can make your life's mission to find an oyster that no one's ever found. That's fucking awesome. It has like super big pearls, maybe. You never know. But anyways, that's just interesting there. And there's many, like I said, there's many different kinds. So always keep in mind that nature is infinite. There's so much, to be found and to be discovered. That should excite you. That alone should excite you. So you might be wondering what New York is actually doing about this problem. Well, like I said, that New York waters have been the cleanest they've been in over 100 years, which is good. They're still fucking filthy, but it's good. We're making progress. Um, it's important to understand when I say New York, I mean New York City. Um, there's a lot there. If you go upstate New York, there's actually a lot. It's pretty clean up here, to be honest. But New York City, I'm mainly referring to because that's what people think when they think of oysters in New York and all that stuff. So yeah, there's this thing called the $1 billion or no billion oyster project that their plan is to, or their goal, their mission, their vision is to put a billion oysters back in the water by 2035. They've already put 100 million, I think, into the water system, and that's good. That's amazing. Will they hit a million by 2035? I hope so. I hope so. They have volunteer opportunities and education for the community and stuff like that. I'm not saying do it, but if you want to, there it is. And I'll leave all the resources, all the articles. I read a book for this too. It's like The Big Oyster or something, down in the description. But anyways, now we will one day, because this is just about me for a second. I don't like sitting inside. It's the worst, guys. It's the worst. I don't even like making videos inside. A normal person would fucking set up the camera inside. It's fucking freezing outside. It's like 30 degrees. But I don't like being inside all that much. When I see a desk, I just fucking cringe. So I like being outside. So one day we will go and forage for oysters. Whether it's in fucking New Zealand, Nantucket, because you could do that there. We're gonna go forage for oysters and find ourselves some freaking gnarly, delicious oysters, guys. Um, because that's fun. That's what I find fun. That adventure, going there with a mission, with a vision, not to just sit on a beach on my ass. I mean, like, like really, to go there with a purpose, to travel with a purpose. That's what we're doing. So we'll do that one day, guys. We will do that. I just wanted to make this video. It's so random, but I don't know. I just like oysters. I like the oyster hat. I fucking love this hat. But yeah, guys. I mean, oysters are amazing. They can solve a lot of problems in New York City. There's a lot of the reason I like talking about this because I went through chronic illness, and a big part of that is because our waters are toxic, our food is toxic, everything's been polluted by heavy metals, agrochemicals, pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, all this stuff. And it's not about being afraid to eat anything or to do anything. I'm not. Uh, a lot of people are. Of course, if you're going through chronic illness, um, it's easy to do that. I wouldn't suggest it because healing doesn't happen from fear, but it happens from actually from love. And I don't even like saying love because when I say love, it's very wishy washy. But I mean love, um, and only you can experience that for yourself. And I'm not really talking about a romantic sort of love. That's important too, but I'm talking about a transcendent sort of love that has to be experienced through your experience directly, right? I dropped my pen, but fuck it. But yeah, guys, that's all I got. I hope you like my drawing of the oyster anatomy. Yeah, right there. But anyways, guys, I'll catch you on the next one, and eat your oysters, guys. Clean ones, not the New York ones. Don't poison yourself. But anyways, guys, I'll catch you on the next one. I can barely snap my hands because it's freezing. Peace.